It was one of those peculiar spring evenings when the hedgerows of Hampshire look simultaneously too verdant and too moribund. The daffodils bow their heads like a morning choir, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke and stagnant virtue. The village of Nether Woding, situated with considerable diffidence between the cathedral town of Winton and an unrepentant patch of fenland to the north, prided itself on being the sort of place one would never read about in the Times unless a bishop was retiring or a duck had learned to spell. The most exciting thing to have happened in Nether Woding during the past decade was the arrival of a new vicar, Rev. Simon Venn, whose sermons were described by one elderly parishioner as like being thumped with a velvet cushion. One is always surprised to find it has left a bruise. Venn had come to them from some obscure parish in East Anglia, bringing with him a too-thin wife, a fondness for beetroot jam, and a curious inclination to walk the churchyard at dusk. And it was at precisely 7:03 on the evening of March 14th, a Thursday, or a scandalous approximation thereof, as Lord Peter Wimsey would later mutter, when the aforementioned vicar was found lying quite motionless under the iron arch of the Parsonage Gate. His head had been neatly dashed against the rusted hinge. A fragment of bloodied ivy clung to the brick post. A smear of crimson trailed along the handle of the shepherd's crook walking stick beside him. His spectacles, thin-lensed and rimless, rested 3 feet away in the middle of the gravel path, as if delicately set down by an invisible valet. He was found not by his wife, who claimed to have been listening to Brahms with the volume at what she termed divinely obliterative heights, but by the boy from the village, Walter Pike, dispatched to return the vicar's overdue volume of the Golden Bough. Young Pike, upon seeing the body, dropped the tome in horror, leaving it flung open on a passage about sacrificial kingship. It was, in short, a most inconvenient murder, not simply for the spiritual health of Nether Woding, but for the Bishop of Winton, who was due to arrive the following Sunday for an ecclesiastical tea. Lord Peter Death-Bredden Wimsey, on the other hand, did not find the murder inconvenient at all. He had come down to Hampshire ostensibly to research a minor poem by Robert Herrick, the authorship of which had lately become the subject of tiresome academic dispute. But Wimsey, who possessed the rare ability to combine literary fussiness with an inexplicable knack for stumbling upon corpses, had barely unpacked his edition of Hesperides before news of the unfortunate clergyman reached him at the Black Swan Inn. "Well," he observed dryly to Bunter, his valet and unflappable companion in crime, solving, as they looked over the body the next morning, "this poor fellow seems to have exited with all the dignity of a misplaced comma, present but mispunctuated." "Indeed, my lord," said Bunter, who had already discreetly photographed the wound with a pocket kodak. "The wound is quite clean, a single blunt blow, no signs of a struggle." "Which, you'll observe, is rather a pity," Wimsey said, crouching beside the gate-post. "A good struggle leaves clues. A bad one leaves motive. But this looks planned, Bunter, or rather premeditated with a genteel lack of enthusiasm." He ran a gloved finger along the hinge, noting the faint streak of blood. Then he paused and sniffed. "I say, do you detect an odor of burnt paper?" "I do, my lord." Something theatrical, or perhaps devotional. But who in this quietly ecclesiastical asylum would have both motive and opportunity? "We must inquire delicately, Bunter. The villagers will close up tighter than a maiden aunt's sherry cupboard if we go charging in." "And if I may add, my lord," Bunter intoned, folding the camera away, "the vicar's wife was quite specific. She heard no cries, no disturbances, no sound whatsoever, only the adagio from the Third Symphony." Wimsey's expression shifted. He straightened and looked back at the parsonage, which sat squat and sun-blanched against the sky. "No sound, you say?" "Not even the gate." He touched it. It creaked obligingly. "Then either she lies, or she is extraordinarily inattentive, or something muffled the sound." His gaze traveled to a nearby window, shut but with the faint trace of ash clinging to the sill. "Bunter," he said softly, "let us pay a visit to the good Mrs. Venn. I feel in the mood for beetroot jam and psychological warfare." And so began the matter of the vicar under the gate, a case of such delicacy, deception, and decay that even Lord Peter, in his wittiest and most fastidious moods, would later refer to it as that beastly whispering business in the garden of the Lord. Mrs. Venn received them in the morning room, a chamber that tried very hard to give the impression it had once hosted robust theological debate, but more likely served as the final resting place for floral upholstery in the last 20 years of Country Life magazine. She was a wan figure in lavender, her eyes like dusted crystal, the color of bone china that had stood too long in sunlight. Her handshake was limp, her voice modulated to the precise key of genteel suffering. "Lord Peter, Mr. Bunter, thank you. I'm afraid I've had to refuse the press. There were reporters at the gate this morning. One of them had a drone." "A drone," Whimsy murmured, as if tasting the word. "Most unchristian, I always think, to hover." "I quite agree." She gestured to the settee and took the matching armchair, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "I do not know how I can help you. The police were already quite thorough yesterday." "Indeed. And I dare say they were as industrious as ants and twice as red. But they are rather lacking in the finer sensibilities, nuance, allusion, subtext. I rather thought a civilized conversation might yield more than a dozen notebooks and a trampled hedge." He took the offered tea, oversteeped, predictably, and sipped with the faintest wince. Bunter declined. "Now, Mrs. Venn," Whimsy said, settling back, "if I might ask you to retrace your steps on the evening in question, not merely the important ones, but everything. It is sometimes the dull little habits that prove fatal to mystery." Mrs. Venn looked momentarily lost, then nodded with brittle composure. "Very well. After supper, I had a headache, as I sometimes do. I retired to the music room. Simon knew I disliked being disturbed when I listened to records. He said I disappeared into them." "Did he now? Brahms, wasn't it?" "Yes. The Third Symphony. I put it on at 7 precisely. I remember because I had meant to begin earlier. Supper was delayed." "Ah," said Whimsy, eyes half-lidded. "And was the delay culinary or conversational?" She blinked. "I'm sorry." "The delay, dear lady. Was the meat overdone or the conversation undercooked?" She gave a tight smile. "The roast was late. Mrs. Blodgett had some difficulty with the pilot light." "Mrs. Blodgett being your cook?" "Yes. She's been with us for years. Came from Simon's previous parish." And you listened to the symphony through to the end?" "I believe so. I remember flipping the record, but I didn't notice the time until Walter knocked." "Did you hear the gate?" "The gate?" Her brow furrowed. "No, I don't think I did." "Most peculiar," said Whimsy. "It makes quite a noise. I tested it this morning. Creaks like an old conscience. Forgive me, but you're sure you would have heard it?" "I don't know. Perhaps the music covered it." "Perhaps," said Whimsy thoughtfully. "And your husband? Did he often go out walking at dusk?" "Yes, nearly every evening." "And was he expecting a visitor that night?" She hesitated. "No, not to my knowledge." "And yet he had taken his stick," Whimsy murmured. "The crook handled one. The ceremonial shepherd's staff, I call it." She gave a dry chuckle, surprised at herself. Simon did like his symbolism. "Quite. And one last thing. The vicar's spectacles. Would he have taken them off for any reason?" "Oh, no," she said at once. "He couldn't see 6 inches without them. He even wore them in the bath." Whimsy inclined his head gravely, as if a sacred truth had been imparted. "Thank you. You've been most enlightening." As they left the room, Whimsy paused in the narrow corridor outside. "Now, Bunter," he said in a low voice, "a word with this Mrs. Blodgett, if you please. The orchestration of roasts may conceal more than the divine mysteries of the liturgy." Mrs. Blodgett was found in the scullery plucking a chicken with a vigor that bespoke either strong moral character or a deeply repressed hatred of poultry. She was a squat woman with arms like wrestlers and an expression that suggested every word cost her a personal sacrifice. "Don't know what you want with me," she grumbled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Coppers have already poked through me pantry." "Coppers are known to be savage with pickled onions," said Whimsy. "We're a gentler sort. I merely wonder when you last saw Mr. Venn alive." 7:15, maybe 10 to. He came in from his walk, mud on his shoes. Asked for a flask of tea. "A flask? Yes, sir. Took one now and then. Said it helped him think." "And you saw him leave?" "No, sir. Left it on the hall table. When I came back from the kitchen, both him and the flask were gone." "And the roast? Delayed, I gather." She pursed her lips. "Pilot light again. Devil's machine." But the vicar waited. "Oh, yes. Always waited. Manners, see." "Indeed," said Whimsy, tapping his lip. "And you didn't hear the gate either." "I wasn't listening for it, was I?" "Very fair," he said. "But did you hear anything unusual? Noises, voices, a dog, perhaps?" At this, she hesitated. "Now you mention it. The dog next door, Bodger, started up just before 7, barking like mad, not normal for him." "And what does Bodger normally bark at?" "Strangers, or if he's teased." "Teased? There's boys, yobs really, who come down from the edge of town, like to rattle the fences." "Ah, delightful." Whimsy turned away, then paused. "You wouldn't happen to know if Mr. Venn was fond of bonfires?" "Bonfires?" There was the faintest scent of ash near the study window. She sniffed. "Only thing burned recently was some old sermon notes. Gave 'em to Mr. Venn myself. He had to clear out on Wednesday." "Did he now? And where were they burned?" "Fireplace in the study, sir, though I didn't see him do it. He said he'd light it himself." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "Much obliged." As they stepped out into the garden, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, Bunter said quietly, "What do you make of it, my lord?" Whimsy exhaled. "Too quiet, Bunter. No struggle, no cry. A gate that creaks, unheard, a man who cannot see without glasses, yet they were 3 feet away. A stick laid down neatly, not dropped. A flask of tea, and a barking dog." "An ambush?" "Not quite," said Whimsy. "An appointment." Bunter raised an eyebrow. "But with whom?" "Precisely what I intend to find out. I suggest we pay a call on the church warden, Mr. Henslow. He and the vicar reportedly disagreed on the matter of hymnals and, more interestingly, parish funds. Let us see if this godly fellow has a less than heavenly recollection of Thursday evening." They turned back toward the lane, the parsonage behind, them shuttered and pale, as if the house itself held its breath. Above, the church tower clock struck 10 with mournful deliberation. Something had happened in that narrow stretch of gravelled path. Something seen by no one, heard by no one, yet planned by someone who knew exactly where silence could be most deadly. Whimsy and Bunter found the church warden precisely where one might expect a church warden to be on a Friday morning, polishing brass with ecclesiastical solemnity inside the chill nave of St. Bartholomew's. Mr. Josiah Henslow was a dry man of moderate height, whose face wore the permanent expression of someone about to object to a misuse of the offertory box. His mustache twitched like an affronted weasel's as they approached. "Lord Whimsy, is it? I heard you'd come nosing about." He stood, setting aside a length of wool used to buff the candlesticks. "No offense meant, you understand. Just that we've had quite enough interference from town." "I interfere only where strictly necessary," said Whimsy, removing his gloves. "In this case, necessity and curiosity rather awkwardly coincide. I hope you won't begrudge a few questions asked in the spirit of, shall we say, pastoral concern." Henslow's mustache twitched again. "I've said my piece to the police." "No doubt. But the police, dear man, are inclined to reduce matters to timetables and tool marks. I'm more interested in the, how shall I put it, the emotional furnishings. I beg your pardon? The psychological clutter, Mr. Henslow. The spiritual dust bunnies, if you like. One often finds murder hiding behind a hymn book, pretending to be righteousness. Henslow narrowed his eyes. You're making fun. On the contrary, I'm merely English. The man snorted, then relented with a nod. Very well. What do you want to know? To begin, where were you on the evening of the vicar's death? At home. Had my dinner just after 6. I live alone. My housekeeper leaves at 5. I read the newspaper and then some G.K. Chesterton. A sound choice, said Whimsy, though perhaps a touch exuberant for so glum a night. It's Lent, Henslow said simply, as though this explained everything. Indeed. Did you see the vicar that day? Yes. Briefly. We had words after the vestry committee. He'd proposed diverting part of the restoration fund to buy a new organ. And you disagreed? Of course. The roof leaks. Half the north transept is more moss than masonry. Were your words heated? I don't shout, Lord Whimsy. I state facts. The vicar did not like facts. No, said Whimsy softly. Nor, I suspect, the people who reminded him of them. He turned, studying the church interior. Tell me, Mr. Henslow, is it usual for Mr. Venn to burn papers? The question seemed to discompose him slightly. I suppose it depends. On what? On what sort of papers they were. Indeed. Whimsy faced him again. Did he ever mention sermons or letters that he preferred not to keep? Henslow's eyes flickered. There was talk. Some thought he corresponded with odd people. Spiritualists. Whimsy smiled. Even vicars seek novelty now and again. Did he have any recent disputes outside the parish? Not that I know of, unless you count Mrs. Calthorpe. Who is Mrs. Calthorpe? The widow who lives at Lilac Cottage. She accused the vicar of interfering with her father's will. Claimed Simon had manipulated him into leaving the church a parcel of land. And did he? I doubt it. But the woman's obsessed. Came shouting into the church one Sunday, had to be removed. Most dramatic. I should very much like to meet her. She's mad as a beetle, if you ask me. Oh, I shall, said Whimsy pleasantly. But I do thank you for your candor, Mr. Henslow. It may interest you to know that your name appears nowhere in the village's top 5 list of suspected murderers, though your mustache, I regret, is under active suspicion. With that and a quick bow, Whimsy turned on his heel and exited the church, the sound of their footsteps echoing down the nave like retreating accusations. Outside, the day had warmed slightly, and a faint breeze stirred the grass in the graveyard. Well, my lord, said Bunter, falling into step beside him. Whimsy lit a cigarette and exhaled thoughtfully. A quarrel over funds, a possibly doctored will, and a widow who thinks in curses. The plot thickens like bad blancmange, Bunter. Let us find this Mrs. Calthorpe before the sun dips too low and the village begins inventing new ghosts. Lilac Cottage, despite the bucolic name, resembled nothing so much as the gingerbread house from a slightly more bureaucratic fairy tale. It crouched behind overgrown hedges, with a crooked gate and paint peeling from its windows like neglected pastry. A sign hung askew by the door, proclaiming, "Beware of dog," in letters so faded they now read like an existential warning. Mrs. Calthorpe herself opened the door before Whimsy could knock. She was tall, with an austere profile and eyes that glinted like cracked flint. Her hair was unpinned and smelt faintly of rosemary and mothballs. "I suppose you've come about Simon," she said. "My reputation precedes me." She gestured them in with something between a wave and a curse. "Don't mind the dog. He died in 39. I just keep the sign up." "An effective deterrent," said Whimsy, stepping over the threshold. The sitting room was filled with relics of grief. faded photographs, stacks of yellowing papers, and porcelain figurines that had outlived both their owners and their purpose. "I told them," Mrs. Calthorpe said, not sitting. "I told the bishop, the lawyers, the village hall. Simon Venn killed my father, spiritually if not physically." "How enterprising of him," murmured Whimsy. "How exactly did he manage that?" "He manipulated him, fed him those soft sermons about eternal giving and what not. Said the church needed land to expand its mission." "Which land?" "The orchard by the brook. It was meant for me." "And he left it to the parish?" "Yes, and Simon Venn oversaw it all. As executor, that's not a coincidence. Did you confront him?" "Of course I did. He said it was my father's wish in Christ." "Pah, as if my father ever believed in anything after 1916. "And when did your father die?" "Last June." "Did you continue to see the vicar after that?" "No. I refused to go to church, refused to even walk past the gate." "And the night he died?" Her gaze narrowed. "I was here. Alone. I'm always alone. You can ask the postman. I shouted at him about a misdelivered gas bill around 6:45. "How terribly specific." "I keep records." She nodded to a notebook on the mantelpiece. "May I?" Whimsy asked. She allowed it with a stiff nod. He flipped through the entries, each one an obsessively detailed log of the day, meals, telephone calls, post deliveries, and opinions on weather patterns. "Ah," said Whimsy suddenly. "You noted the barking dog as well." "Yes. It started at 6:58 and stopped at 7:06. I checked the clock." "Very precise. I like to document what the world does while pretending I do not exist." Whimsy closed the book. "And do you think Mr. Venn's death was divine punishment?" "I think," she said slowly, "it was very convenient." "For whom?" "For someone who wanted to shut him up." She said no more, and Whimsy, with a murmured thanks, took his leave. Outside, he lit another cigarette. "Bunter," he said, "we have now heard of one burned sermon, one disputed will, 2 barking dogs, and 3 unsatisfactory alibis." "Yes, my lord." "And yet none of them explain the removed spectacles or the absent cry." "No, my lord." Whimsy looked back toward the parsonage, a distant blot among the hedgerows. "I think," he said quietly, "that we must look not for who hated Simon Venn, but who feared him. Someone who met him that night at the gate, spoke softly, and struck hard." "Someone he trusted?" Bunter asked. Whimsy smiled faintly. "Or someone he pitied." The following morning brought a bracing chill that seemed to settle not only on the dew-speckled fields, but also upon the village itself, as if the fog that hugged the hedgerows was intent on smothering more than just the waking light. Whimsy and Bunter took their time ambling down the narrow lane toward the parsonage once again, the village having awakened into an uneasy stillness that bespoke whispered suspicions and tight-lipped gossip. "Curious," Whimsy remarked, "how a murder tends to reduce a once jovial hamlet to the atmosphere of a poorly attended wake. Though one might say it is the customary effect of any murder, no matter the locale." "Indeed, my lord," Bunter replied, "and the local constabulary seem quite eager to wrap matters up before the moon completes its cycle." "Ah, yes, the rush to justice, or at least to a verdict, often leads to overlooking the less obvious truths." Whimsy adjusted his cravat with a faint smile. "But we are not in so much haste, are we?" Before they reached the parsonage gate, a figure stepped out from beneath the twisted branches of an ancient elm, the vicar's housekeeper, Mrs. Prudence Marlowe. Her face was as lined as the worn hands she clasped nervously in front of her apron, and her eyes darted anxiously between the 2 men. "Lord Whimsy, sir," she began, voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I ought to have said sooner, but I was too frightened." "Pray, do not let fear deter the truth," Whimsy said gently, inclining his head. "What is it that weighs on your conscience?" She swallowed and glanced around as if to ensure no one else was within earshot. "It's about the night the vicar died. I heard something odd, just before the church bell tolled." Whimsy's brow arched. "Something odd, you say?" "Yes, sir. When I was finishing in the kitchen, I thought I heard footsteps near the front door, but they weren't like anyone coming to visit. They were soft, hesitant, and then, just before 7, there was a sharp noise, like a scuffle or a fall. Then silence." Bunter's hand twitched toward his notebook. "And yet," Whimsy murmured, "no one reported hearing a disturbance." Mrs. Marlowe shook her head. "No, sir. I thought it was the vicar himself moving about, or perhaps a late visitor. But when the bell rang, I looked outside and saw nothing. The street was empty." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "You mentioned the bell tolled at 7. "Just so, sir." "Then we must confirm if that is accurate." The parsonage was still wrapped in the morning's muted gloom, its weathered facade catching the soft daylight through a haze of early mist. Whimsy led the way inside with Bunter at his heels, each step stirring memories into the dusty corners of the hall. They found the ancient church clock, a grand mechanism of brass gears and wooden cogs, ensconced within its turret, its face worn yet dignified. Whimsy ran a gloved finger along the dial. "If this old fellow tells true, the bell should ring promptly on the hour." "May I?" Bunter offered, producing a small torch. Whimsy smiled. "By all means, though I would caution against treating this like a séance." With careful precision, Bunter examined the clockworks, noting the alignment of gears and the mechanism responsible for releasing the bell striker. "It appears the timing is set by a series of cams and a weighted pendulum," Bunter observed. "If the weights are uneven or the cams misaligned, the bell might toll early or late. Or be silent altogether," Whimsy added. They agreed to test the bell that afternoon, when the clock keeper was available. For now, there were other interviews to be pursued, and Mrs. Marlowe's revelation had placed the timeline into sharper focus. Their next call was upon the vicar's niece, Miss Clarissa Venn, a young woman of impeccable breeding and an expression that fluctuated between composed restraint and barely concealed grief. She met them in the drawing room, a chamber hung with heavy drapes and portraits of stern ancestors. "I appreciate your coming," she said, voice clear, yet with an undertone of vulnerability. Uncle Simon was a complicated man. Devoted to his parish, yes, but secretive to a fault. Whimsy regarded her with his customary arch amusement. "A secretive clergyman? How very Gothic. Pray, Miss Venn, what secrets did your uncle hide?" She hesitated, fingers twisting a handkerchief. "He spoke often of burdens, but never specifics. There was a letter he received a few weeks before his death that distressed him greatly. I asked what it was, but he only said it was the weight of the world pressing on his soul." "And did he share the letter with anyone?" "No, but he did show it to me briefly." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded sheet of parchment. "I saved it. Perhaps it might help your inquiries." Whimsy took the letter carefully. The paper was aged, the ink faded but legible. "You meddle in affairs beyond your ken. Cease your prying or suffer the consequences." Whimsy's lips twitched, a vague threat, couched in ominous tones. Quite the inspiration for a mystery novelist, if one were inclined to pen such trifles. Clarissa nodded. He did not take it lightly. "I'm certain he feared for his safety." "Did he ever say who sent it?" "No. The letter bore no signature or postmark." "Curious," Whimsy mused. "And this was before his disputes with Mrs. Calthorpe, I presume?" "Yes, several weeks prior. I fear he was entangled in matters deeper than parish politics." As Clarissa spoke, Bunter's eyes lingered on a clock above the mantelpiece. Its hands pointed firmly to 5 minutes past 6. "An odd time for a clock to be stopped," he murmured. "Indeed," Whimsy said, stepping forward. "Miss Venn, would you mind if we examined the other timepieces in the house?" She consented, and they moved through the rooms, noting clocks large and small. The kitchen clock ran fast by 10 minutes. The grandfather clock in the hall had stopped altogether. The bedroom watch, lying abandoned on a dresser, was an hour behind. A veritable conspiracy of confused timekeepers, Whimsy observed dryly. One might suspect an attempt to muddle the timeline. Or simply the eccentricity of a vicar and his household, Clarissa offered with a faint smile. But eccentricities that might conceal deliberate artifice, Whimsy said. Time, Miss Venn, is the great alibi maker and breaker. Our task is to discern which. Bunter jotted down their findings, while Whimsy's gaze fell upon a curious detail, a faint scorch mark near the edge of the writing desk, half hidden beneath a blotter. What do we have here? Whimsy mused, lifting the blotter. Clarissa peered over his shoulder. That mark. It must be from the letter. Uncle Simon was fond of burning correspondence he wished to keep secret. Yet he left this fragment behind. Perhaps unintentionally, Clarissa said, a shadow passing over her face. A reminder that secrets, like embers, can smolder unnoticed until stirred. Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of the local constable, Inspector Trench, a man whose well-meaning efforts were often undermined by a certain provincial narrowness. "Ah, Lord Whimsy, Bunter," Trench greeted, rubbing his hands. "I trust your inquiries are progressing." "Indeed, Inspector," Whimsy said smoothly, "though I confess the temporal anomalies within this household are rather more perplexing than the usual misdemeanors of the village." Trench sniffed. "Well, timekeeping isn't high on my list of suspects." "No, but perhaps the manipulation of time is," Whimsy replied, his smile thinly veiled. Trench glanced about, uncomfortable. "Look, I don't want to step on anyone's toes, but we've got a likely culprit. Old Jenkins, the gardener, found with the vicar's spectacles in his hut." "Spectacles?" Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "And what is his alibi?" "He says he was in town buying seed corn. No one can vouch for him, but it seems plausible." Whimsy exchanged a glance with Bunter. "We shall investigate further, Inspector." As Trench took his leave, Whimsy turned to Bunter. "The gardener's story is a convenient one, but too tidy by half. There is something much less obvious at work here." Bunter nodded. "The devil, as always, lurks in the details." "Precisely." Whimsy's eyes gleamed with renewed vigor. "And our next step must be to test the bell, confirm the timings, and then, most importantly, retrace the steps of the night in question with meticulous care." As they left the parsonage, the village seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that beneath the calm veneer, the gears of a deeper mystery were beginning to grind into motion. The game was afoot, and Lord Peter Whimsy's smile was no longer merely ironic. It was a harbinger of revelation. The afternoon sun struggled through a haze of mist, casting a pale, uncertain light over the village, as Whimsy and Bunter returned to the church tower, accompanied by the clock-keeper, a gaunt, pale man named Mr. Hargreaves. His spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, he exuded the kind of nervous energy that suggested a lifelong acquaintance with gears and springs rather than people. "Now then, gentlemen," Hargreaves began, rubbing his thin hands together, "the clock here is quite the temperamental beast. It's over 2 centuries old, and no amount of oil or patience can fully tame it." Whimsy smiled, the hint of irony unmistakable. "One might say it is a fitting guardian for secrets, then." Together, they ascended the narrow, winding stairs to the clock chamber, the air growing cooler and heavier with every step. Upon reaching the chamber, the large clockworks dominated the space, polished brass wheels interlocking with wooden cogs, their teeth worn but resolute. "Shall we test it?" Whimsy asked. Hargreaves nodded, flicking a lever to disengage the mechanism and win the weights. The bell ought to strike on the hour with precise timing, but, well, you'll see. Whimsy observed closely as the pendulum swung, steady and sure. But something was amiss. A small, hidden catch on the release lever seemed to stick intermittently. "Aha," Whimsy said softly. There lies our culprit for any untimely tolling. A slight obstruction could delay or hasten the bell's chime. Hargreaves chuckled nervously. I suspected as much. It has caused confusion before, but nothing sinister. Just mechanical caprice. Mechanical, yes, Whimsy agreed. Yet timing is everything in a murder investigation. We must account for every second. The bell tolled once, twice, thrice, and then in rapid succession, before settling into its proper rhythm. Bunter jotted down the irregularities, noting the seconds lost or gained. Very well, Whimsy said, descending the stairs. We now know the bell could have chimed a few minutes early or late on the night in question. That complicates matters, but also provides an opportunity. Bunter raised an eyebrow. How so, my lord? If the bell's toll was used as a temporal marker, if those in the house relied upon it to confirm their actions, then any deviation might have been exploited or misunderstood. Back in the parsonage, Whimsy and Bunter resumed their inquiries, this time with the servants who had been on duty the night of the murder. Each swore to knowing nothing at all, yet the patterns beneath their denials were beginning to emerge. Mrs. Marlowe, the housekeeper, was first to be questioned again. I swear, Lord Whimsy, I heard nothing more after those footsteps near the door. I was in the kitchen most of the evening. And the kitchen is adjacent to the front entrance? Whimsy asked. Yes, sir, but the door was kept shut. The servants are strict about it. Whimsy's eyes flickered. Indeed. And yet, you heard footsteps? Aye, soft ones. I thought it might be the vicar himself, or someone who wished to be mistaken for him. Whimsy's tone was lighter, but the implication was not lost. From the scullery came the faint rustle of a broom being stilled as a young maid, Eliza, was ushered in. She appeared timid, eyes cast downward. Miss Eliza, can you tell us of the evening in question? Anything at all that struck you as odd? She hesitated. Well, I did see Mr. Jenkins, the gardener, near the back gate around 6:30. He was talking to someone I couldn't see clearly. They seemed to be arguing. Did you hear what was said? No, ma'am, but Mr. Jenkins looked angry when he left. Whimsy's interest deepened. And the back gate, is it soundproofed? Eliza shook her head. No, sir, it's near the hedge, and the wind carries sounds easily. Thank you, Miss Eliza. Bunter gave her a reassuring smile as she slipped away. Whimsy turned to Bunter. A quarrel in the garden at 6:30. The gardener's uncorroborated alibi to buy seed corn in town at that hour suddenly appears less certain. Yet we must tread carefully, Bunter reminded. Guilt by proximity is a dangerous thing. True, but it is the context that will give us clarity. Whimsy's eyes gleamed with renewed focus. Their next visitor was Dr. Edmund Pritchard, the village physician, a man with a florid complexion and a demeanor that oscillated between brusque and overfamiliar. Lord Whimsy, he greeted with a firm handshake, I trust your investigations are proceeding apace? As well as can be expected, Doctor. Your testimony regarding the time of death will be crucial. Ah, yes, Pritchard replied, settling into a chair. Based on rigor mortis and the cooling of the body, I estimate death occurred around 7 o'clock, plus or minus 10 minutes. Did you notice any peculiarities during your examination? Well, the body was unusually cold, considering the season. I suspect exposure to an open window or a draught. A detail easily overlooked, Whimsy said. Do you recall if any window in the vicarage was left open that night? Not in the main rooms, but I did notice one slightly ajar in the study. Which study? The one facing the garden, on the ground floor. Whimsy's mind raced. The study facing the garden, near the back gate where Jenkins was seen arguing. This cannot be coincidence. Pritchard nodded. I thought the same, and there were no signs of forced entry. Whimsy's fingers steepled. A visitor who came and went quietly, perhaps even welcomed. After Pritchard's departure, Whimsy and Bunter walked the grounds once more, tracing the pathway from the back gate to the study window. The garden was a tangle of late-season blooms and overgrown hedges, the shadows lengthening as dusk approached. "There is a distinct scent here," Bunter remarked, bending to sniff. "Something sharp, metallic." "A subtle clue," Whimsy replied. "Possibly a dropped item or the residue of a struggle." They discovered a slender scrap of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush near the pathway, deep green in hue and embroidered with a gold thread, a detail out of place in the rustic garden. "Likely from a jacket cuff," Whimsy surmised, pocketing the fragment. Bunter turned his attention to a small, nearly invisible indentation in the soil. "Footprint, my lord. A gentleman's shoe, perhaps. The heel shows wear on the right side." "Very astute." Whimsy knelt to examine the mark. "If we could match this to our suspects, it might provide an invaluable lead." Their exploration was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Trench once more, his expression clouded with impatience. "Any progress?" he asked brusquely. "A few intriguing pieces," Whimsy replied smoothly, "including a meeting in the garden, a study window left ajar, and a fragment of fabric." Trench's eyes narrowed. "I hope you don't mind if I question Jenkins again. He claims innocence, but I'm not convinced." "By all means," Whimsy said. "The gardener's story merits scrutiny." Later that evening, they met Jenkins in the dim light of his hut. The man was weather-beaten, his eyes wary, but he maintained a brittle composure. "Mr. Jenkins," Whimsy began, "Miss Eliza mentioned a quarrel near the back gate around 6:30. Care to elaborate?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "I was just telling old Tom to keep off my patch, that's all. No quarrel, just a warning." "Tom being?" "Local drunkard. Not worth the bother." "And your alibi for 6:30 to 7? "I was in town, like I said. Bought seed corn for the vicar's garden. Ask at the shop if you doubt me." Whimsy's smile was thin but polite. "We shall do so. Tell me, Mr. Jenkins, do you recognize this?" He looked down at the fabric fragment Whimsy produced. His face paled slightly. "I can't say I do, sir." "And these?" Whimsy showed him a photograph of the local lawyer, Mr. Felix Rudd, a man known for his sharp suits and sharper tongue. Jenkins's gaze hardened. I know him. Don't like the man one bit." "Why is that?" "Mr. Rudd's always looking to make trouble, and he's been sniffing around the vicar about the estate lately." Whimsy stored the information carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. We may have more questions in time." As Jenkins left, Bunter whispered, "The gardener's tale is full of holes, but so too is everyone's." "Precisely," Whimsy said, "and it is those holes that we shall stitch together into a seamless fabric of truth." That night, back at the parsonage, Whimsy sat by the window, pipe in hand, eyes tracing the wavering shadows cast by the flickering gaslight. The village slept uneasily, and so did he, not from exhaustion, but from the restless stirrings of a mind unwilling to be satisfied by half-truths. The threads of time, place, and motive tangled before him, yet he sensed that the crucial knot lay still hidden. The bell, the garden, the open window, the threatening letter, all were pieces of a puzzle waiting for the final, telling move. As the clock ticked unevenly in the hall below, Lord Peter Whimsy smiled thinly. The game was far from over. The following morning dawned pale and grey, the mist still hanging low over the village, casting the narrow streets and thatched roofs in a muted, dreamlike light. Lord Peter Whimsy and Bunter departed early for the market town, intent on following up on Mr. Jenkins's alibi. The seed shop was a modest establishment near the center of the village square, its wooden sign creaking gently in the faint breeze. Inside, an elderly shopkeeper named Mrs. Cadwell was arranging sacks of grain and seed packets on a low shelf. At Whimsy's polite inquiry, she nodded thoughtfully. "Aye, Mr. Jenkins was here yesterday afternoon, just about 6 o'clock. Bought a sack of pea seeds, he did. Paid with a couple of coins, no trouble. And did anyone else come with him? Bunter asked quietly. Mrs. Cadwell furrowed her brow. No, not that I recall. Jenkins usually comes alone, a quiet man. But, now you mention it, I did see him speaking to a stranger on the street nearby, just before he came in. Whimsy's interest piqued. A stranger, you say? Could you describe him? Hard to say. Tall, dark coat, but his hat was pulled low, so I couldn't see his face. Looked hurried, like he didn't want to be noticed. Bunter glanced at Whimsy. That matches Eliza's description of the argument near the back gate, doesn't it? Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, we may be dealing with a visitor who slipped in unnoticed, yet with a purpose. Let us see if the village constable has any reports of strangers. The constable, a stout, ruddy-faced man named Prowse, was found at the police station, a cramped room redolent of ink and dust. When questioned, he admitted a vague report of a stranger passing through the village on the afternoon in question, heading toward the vicarage. Did anyone recognize him or know his business? Whimsy asked. Not exactly. Most folk just nod and keep their heads down. But Mrs. Farrow, the schoolmistress, mentioned she saw a man loitering near the churchyard gate just after 5. She thought him odd, but couldn't say why. Whimsy filed the information carefully. A man loitering near the churchyard gate, speaking to Jenkins near the back gate, then disappearing before Jenkins came to buy seed corn. It forms a curious timeline. Bunter, ever methodical, pulled out his notebook. If the stranger was near the churchyard at 5, then at the back gate shortly thereafter, and Jenkins bought seed corn around 6, the stranger had ample time to approach the vicarage and retreat before nightfall. Exactly. Whimsy's tone was quiet, but purposeful. We must learn more about this visitor's identity. The village, though small, held its share of secrets beneath its bucolic exterior. As they left the police station, Whimsy suggested a visit to the schoolhouse, where Mrs. Farrow might provide further insight. The schoolhouse was a modest brick building, windows smeared with dust and fingerprints, a small bell above the door silent for the weekend. Mrs. Farrow was a thin woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression, though warmed somewhat by the arrival of an outsider interested in village affairs. I remember the man clearly, she said after some thought. He was standing by the gate, looking around as if waiting for someone. I thought it strange because he wasn't a local. There was something about his manner, the way he moved, not like any villager I know. Could you describe him in more detail? Whimsy asked. She nodded. Dark hair, slightly graying at the temples. He wore a coat that looked expensive but was dusty, as if he had traveled a long way, and he had a small black briefcase. Bunter exchanged a glance with Whimsy. A briefcase? That suggests business rather than pleasure. Indeed. Whimsy tapped his pipe thoughtfully. And what time exactly did you see him? Just after 5, on the dot. I was locking up when I glanced out the window. He didn't linger after a few minutes, walked toward the back gate. The pieces began to fit together more clearly. A stranger with a briefcase seen near the churchyard gate at 5, then arguing with Jenkins at the back gate, before Jenkins bought seed corn at 6. This visitor's presence seemed deliberately timed. Returning to the vicarage, Whimsy and Bunter resumed their investigations. The study window, which Dr. Pritchard had noted ajar, was carefully examined by the gardener, Mr. Jenkins, under Whimsy's watchful eye. Jenkins insisted the window had been left open by the vicar himself during the warm afternoon air. Is that so? Whimsy pressed. You have no idea if anyone else might have used the window that evening? Jenkins hesitated, then shook his head. No, my lord. The vicar was particular about security. No one else had keys. Whimsy observed the lock closely. It was an old-fashioned latch, easy to unlatch from the inside, but almost impossible to force from outside without making noise. Was the window open when you arrived that evening? Whimsy asked. Yes, sir. Did you close it? No, I did not think to. This raised the possibility that the murderer could have entered or exited through the study window without raising suspicion, especially if the victim or others inside had left it open deliberately. Bunter moved to inspect the garden path again, this time noticing a faint scuff mark near the window. "My lord, this looks like it was made recently, perhaps by shoes dragged slightly." Whimsy crouched beside him. "Indeed, and the soil here is softer than the rest, allowing for more distinct impressions. If we could find a matching shoe or boot, it would be invaluable." As evening crept over the village, a sharp rap at the front door interrupted their work. It was Inspector Trench, looking graver than before. "Lord Whimsy, I've just received word from the magistrate's office. There's an urgent summons for you. Something has come to light that may concern the vicar's affairs." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Very well, Inspector. Lead the way." The summons related to a recent discovery among the vicar's personal papers. An unsigned will hidden in a secret compartment within the desk in the study. The will named the vicar as beneficiary of a considerable sum left by a distant relative, contingent on the vicar surviving for a year after the relative's death, which had occurred only months prior. "This complicates matters," Whimsy mused. "A financial motive, perhaps, and the document's concealment suggests the vicar wished it kept secret." Inspector Trench nodded. "I'm beginning to suspect more than just a garden quarrel or a stray visitor. Someone might have been watching and waiting for an opportunity to claim that inheritance, or to prevent its claim altogether." Whimsy's voice was low, but firm. Back at the vicarage, the discovery raised new questions about those closest to the vicar. The lawyer, Mr. Felix Rudd, who Jenkins had openly disliked, suddenly assumed greater significance. It was known that Rudd had been handling the estate affairs, and rumors whispered that he stood to gain if the vicar's inheritance were contested or invalidated. Bunter observed, if the vicar's death were ruled suspicious or the will questioned, it might delay the transfer of funds and potentially benefit those involved in the estate's management. "Precisely." Whimsy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "We must speak with Mr. Rudd without delay." At the lawyer's office, Whimsy and Bunter were received in a room lined with heavy books and dark wood panels. Felix Rudd was a man in his late 40s with an air of polished confidence and a faint smirk that suggested he believed himself above suspicion. "Lord Whimsy, an unexpected pleasure," Rudd greeted. "I understand you have questions regarding the vicar's unfortunate demise." "We do," Whimsy replied evenly. "First, may I ask if you were aware of the hidden will?" Rudd's smile faltered. "Only recently. The vicar was a private man. Many of his affairs were not disclosed to me until after his death." "Curious," Whimsy said. "And do you stand to gain from the estate?" "Only insofar as my fees for managing the legal affairs," Rudd answered smoothly. "I assure you, my interests are strictly professional." "Yet you have a history of sharp dealings with some villagers, including Mr. Jenkins." Rudd's expression tightened. "Jenkins is a troublesome man, prone to slander. His grievances are irrelevant to this matter." Whimsy was not convinced, but refrained from pressing further immediately. Instead, he asked, "Were you in the village on the evening of the murder?" "I was," Rudd admitted, "but I spent the evening at my chambers, working late." "Can anyone corroborate that?" "Several clerks and a housekeeper," Rudd replied. Whimsy made a mental note to verify this alibi carefully. Leaving the lawyer's office, Bunter commented, "Rudd is slippery, my lord. Too smooth to be innocent outright." Whimsy smiled thinly. "But innocence is not proved by smoothness, Bunter. It is the facts that must be followed." Back at the vicarage, Whimsy's thoughts returned to the fragment of fabric found near the garden. The deep green cloth with gold embroidery suggested a man of some standing, perhaps connected to the village's more affluent residents. He resolved to question the village gentry next, beginning with the local magistrate, Sir Reginald Hampstead. Sir Reginald's estate was imposing, set atop a hill overlooking the village. The magistrate himself was a stout, authoritative man with a hawkish gaze, known for his strict sense of order and justice. When Wimsey questioned him about anyone matching the stranger's description or any unusual visitors, Sir Reginald's face darkened. "There has been talk," the magistrate said reluctantly, "of a man named Carter, a solicitor from London, recently seen here. Some say he was interested in the vicar's estate. Do you know if Mr. Carter might match the man described near the churchyard gate?" Sir Reginald nodded slowly. "Possibly. Carter is a tall man, dark coat, often wears a black briefcase. He arrived a few days ago and has been asking discreet questions." Wimsey's pulse quickened. "Where might we find Mr. Carter?" "I believe he is staying at the inn on the village outskirts," the magistrate replied. The threads were weaving tighter. A mysterious solicitor, a hidden will, a quarrel in the garden, and a fragile timeline all pointed toward a calculated act rather than a random crime. As the afternoon sun dipped low, Wimsey and Bunter made their way to the inn, the weight of impending revelation settling over them like the approaching twilight. The door to the inn's parlor creaked open, and a tall man with graying hair and a keen, watchful expression rose to greet them. "Mr. Carter?" Wimsey inquired smoothly. "Indeed," the man said, his voice calm but guarded. "And you must be Lord Peter Wimsey." "Correct," Wimsey answered. "We have some questions regarding the late vicar's affairs." Carter's eyes flicked briefly to Bunter, then back to Wimsey. "I thought as much. Please, let us speak in private." Inside, the conversation began in measured tones, each man careful to reveal just enough and no more. Yet beneath the surface, the currents of motive and opportunity swirled, drawing closer to a hidden truth waiting to be unearthed. The room in which Wimsey and Carter now sat was cramped but orderly, its heavy oak furniture polished to a dull gleam by decades of use, and the thick curtains drawn against the late afternoon chill. Carter poured himself a small measure of whiskey and offered a glass to Wimsey, who declined with a polite shake of the head. "I trust," began Carter, settling himself with the composure of a man accustomed to measured discourse, "that your inquiries are both thorough and discreet. This village is hardly the place for scandal, though it appears scandal may have come calling despite our best efforts." Wimsey inclined his head, his pale eyes observing Carter closely, noting the slight twitch at the corner of the solicitor's mouth, a micro-expression betraying something between irritation and guarded caution. "Discretion is indeed a virtue," Wimsey replied smoothly, "especially when dealing with the affairs of a deceased man whose secrets are, by definition, confined to the silence of the grave. Might I ask what your precise interest in the late Reverend Pritchard was?" Carter took a slow sip of whiskey before responding. The vicar was the beneficiary of a modest legacy from a distant relative, a sum not to be sneezed at in these austere times. "I was retained to ascertain the legalities surrounding the inheritance and to ensure all paperwork was in order." "And yet," Wimsey said, "the will you refer to was concealed in a secret compartment, unknown even to Mr. Rudd, the village lawyer, until after the vicar's death. Such concealment suggests the vicar did not wish the matter to be common knowledge." Carter's gaze flickered, but he recovered quickly. "I cannot speak for the vicar's motivations, my lord. Such men often have reasons beyond our ken for their secrecy." "A convenient answer," Wimsey murmured. "But the matter at hand is the sequence of events on the evening of the vicar's murder. You were seen in the village in the days prior, and witnesses place you near the churchyard gate at precisely the time Jenkins reported an altercation with an unknown man." "Ah," Carter said, his voice tightening. "I concede that I was near the churchyard, but only because I was trying to find the vicar to deliver urgent documents. Our correspondence had become irregular, and I feared for his health." "Urgent documents?" Wimsey arched an eyebrow. "Yes, papers concerning the administration of the estate. There had been discrepancies that required the vicar's immediate attention. I was unsuccessful in finding him, as you know, but I assure you my intentions were strictly professional." Whimsy's fingers tapped lightly on the arm of his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. One wonders, then, why no one saw you attempt to gain entrance to the vicarage through conventional means. Instead, you were near the rear garden gate, which was noted as the scene of a heated argument. Carter smiled thinly. One often looks for the simplest path, but the most direct is not always the easiest to access, especially when discretion is desired. Discretion in delivering documents to one's client, or discretion to conceal something else. Whimsy's tone was clipped but courteous. The tension in the room thickened. Carter's composure faltered for a split second, a small sigh escaping before he regained control. "Lord Whimsy, I understand the nature of your suspicions, but I assure you I had no reason to harm the vicar. Our relationship was strictly business." "Yet," Whimsy said, rising to his feet and pacing slowly, "someone wanted the vicar silenced before he could execute that will and claim his rightful legacy. The argument witnessed by Jenkins and others points to a man desperate, and the hidden will found among the vicar's papers indicates a motive beyond simple murder." Carter remained seated, lips pressed thin. "Then you have your suspicions, but no proof." "Not yet," Whimsy said, returning to his seat with a faint smile. "But I am intrigued by the man who disappears as soon as the vicar's death is discovered. Who might that be, I wonder?" Carter's eyes darkened, and he stood abruptly. "I see no purpose in prolonging this conversation, Lord Whimsy. The facts will speak for themselves." Whimsy rose as well, nodding slightly. "Indeed, Mr. Carter, I trust your cooperation will be forthcoming when the time comes." As Carter left the room, Bunter stepped forward. "My lord, Carter's evasiveness is troubling, but we must verify his alibi and examine the documents he mentioned." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Yes. Meanwhile, I shall revisit the vicarage. Something about that hidden compartment intrigues me, and I have a lingering suspicion that we have yet to consider the full extent of the victim's personal relationships." The drive back to the vicarage was quiet, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting long shadows over the rolling fields. The village itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the final threads of the mystery were drawing tight. Inside the study, Whimsy carefully examined the desk once more. The secret compartment had revealed the will, but a closer inspection revealed faint scratches and indentations around the lock mechanism. Signs that the compartment had been opened more than once, perhaps recently. Someone was searching for this will, Whimsy mused aloud, and someone knew exactly where to look. Bunter pointed to the edge of the desk. "There's a small pile of papers here, partially hidden under a blotter. They look like correspondence." Whimsy leafed through the letters with his usual meticulous care. Most were mundane, discussing parish matters or local charities, but one envelope bore a London postmark and a neat, flowing script. "Here we are," Whimsy said, extracting the letter and reading it silently. "A note from a woman named Evelyn Marsh, dated a fortnight ago. She implores the vicar to meet her and reveals a secret that could change everything." Bunter raised an eyebrow. "A secret, you say? This village does seem full of them." Whimsy folded the letter carefully. "Indeed, and if Miss Marsh is willing to write such a letter, it suggests a personal connection far deeper than the vicar's public persona." The investigation was no longer about inheritance alone. It was about unspoken ties and hidden passions. That evening, under the dim gaslight of the village inn, Whimsy and Bunter discussed the emerging threads. The vicar's world was larger than anyone imagined, Whimsy reflected. The presence of a stranger solicitor, a concealed will, and now this mysterious Miss Marsh. All point to a man who lived with shadows, both within and without. Bunter nodded. "We must find this Miss Marsh. She may hold the key to the vicar's final days." "Exactly," Whimsy said, eyes gleaming. "Tomorrow, we seek her out." As night settled over the village, the whisper of secrets rustled through the hedgerows, and somewhere beyond the flickering candlelight, the truth awaited its revelation. The next morning dawned with a brittle chill, the sky a steel-grey promise of rain, as if the very atmosphere conspired to keep secrets buried a little longer. Whimsy and Bunter set off from the vicarage with measured purpose, their destination Miss Evelyn Marsh's lodgings in the village. The walk took them down a narrow lane flanked by weathered cottages whose peeling paint and uneven windows spoke of quiet decay, a stark contrast to the genteel facades one might expect in such a place. Arriving at a modest two-story house, Whimsy surveyed the door, noting the faint impression of a brass knocker worn smooth by many hands and the curtains drawn tightly behind a small window. He rapped lightly, his knuckles echoing softly against the wood. There was a moment's hesitation before the door creaked open, revealing a woman of about 30, with sharp features framed by dark curling hair. Her eyes, a cool slate gray, flickered with guarded curiosity rather than surprise. "Mr. Whimsy, I presume," she said, her voice steady but with a trace of tension. "You must forgive my caution, but the village is small, and gossip travels faster than truth." Whimsy inclined his head with his customary half-smile. "Miss Marsh, I assure you, my visit is in the interests of truth and justice, not idle curiosity. I've come regarding your letter to Reverend Pritchard." Her expression tightened imperceptibly, but she stepped aside to admit them. The interior was sparse but neat, furnished with an economy that suggested either modest means or a deliberate avoidance of excess. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, lending the room an air of restrained civility. "Please sit," she offered, motioning toward a small settee by the fire, where Bunter settled with practiced ease. Whimsy remained standing, as was his habit when matters were serious. "You wrote to the vicar, warning that your secret could change everything. Might I ask what that secret was?" Whimsy's tone was gentle but incisive. Evelyn hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of a woolen shawl draped across her lap. "It's not a secret I chose to reveal lightly. Reverend Pritchard and we shared a past, one that many here would find inconvenient if they knew." "Indeed?" Whimsy's eyebrows lifted. "The parish certainly seems a world of politeness and propriety, but I have learned that beneath such veneers lie currents far more turbulent." She nodded. "We met in London some years ago. He was not the man this village believes him to be. There were complications. His role in my life was complicated by promises made and broken." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Promises, you say? Did these pertain to his personal affairs, his clerical duties, or something else entirely?" "Both, perhaps," Evelyn replied softly. "He spoke often of duty, but his own conduct sometimes fell short. I feared that if the truth came out, it would destroy his standing here, and yet it is the truth that now costs him his life." Bunter cleared his throat. "Miss Marsh, would you care to explain the nature of these complications? Anything you can share could be crucial." Evelyn looked from one to the other, weighing her options. Finally, she exhaled a breath that seemed to carry years of sorrow. "Reverend Pritchard was once involved in a scandal, before his arrival here, that threatened to ruin him. A scandal involving a young woman myself. I was the subject of his attentions, and it ended badly. There were whispers of impropriety, and though nothing was proven, it tainted us both." "Yet you remained silent all this time," Whimsy observed. "Until recently," she said, voice breaking slightly. "Because I discovered that the past was catching up with him, that the man who had threatened to expose our secret was back in the village, and that the will, one that altered everything, was somehow connected to this." Whimsy's mind pieced together the threads. The will concealed in the secret compartment, then, was not merely a document of property and money, but a shield against exposure. "Exactly," Evelyn said, her gaze steady now. "Reverend Pritchard hoped to protect himself and those he cared for, but someone wanted that protection destroyed." The room grew heavy with unspoken implications. Whimsy stood, smoothing his jacket, a faint smile playing about his lips. "Miss Marsh, you have been most candid, and I thank you. Your courage will not go unnoticed." "Is there anyone you suspect?" Bunter asked gently. Evelyn shook her head. "I do not know, but I sensed the man who confronted the vicar at the gate was someone familiar, someone who had a score to settle." "Indeed," Whimsy murmured. "A score settled by violence rather than words." After bidding farewell, the two men left the house with a shared sense of urgency. The vicar's past, so carefully hidden, was unraveling swiftly, and with it the motivations of those around him became clearer. Back at the vicarage, Whimsy insisted on revisiting the garden gate, the scene of the fatal confrontation. The gate itself was wrought iron, its paint peeling and rusted in places, the hinges squeaking faintly in the breeze. It was clear from footprints in the damp earth that a struggle had taken place. The disturbed soil and broken twigs attested to a scuffle. Whimsy bent low, examining the ground meticulously. "Notice here," he said, pointing to a narrow indentation near the gatepost. A small piece of cloth caught on the rusted iron. It appears to be from a coat sleeve, though not one of the vicar's. Bunter crouched beside him. "A clue overlooked in the initial examination?" "Precisely. And here," Whimsy continued, moving to the adjoining hedge, "scratch marks along the bark, likely made in a frantic attempt to ward off an attacker." He stood and looked around. The assailant must have been desperate or angry, too reckless for someone seeking a quiet solution. "Could the solicitor have been that desperate man?" Bunter asked. "Carter's motives seem more calculated than violent," Whimsy replied thoughtfully. "No, our man is someone with a personal vendetta, someone driven by emotion rather than cold business." A sudden sound caught their attention, a faint rustle behind the hedge. Both men turned swiftly, but saw nothing save for the swaying branches and a startled bird taking flight. Whimsy smiled dryly. "Even the countryside conspires to delay us." As dusk fell, they returned to the village inn, where the local constable awaited with a new piece of information. An elderly woman named Mrs. Talbot, who lived near the church, had come forward with a startling observation. "Mrs. Talbot claims," the constable reported, "that on the night of the murder she heard voices in the vicarage garden, and one of them was distinctly male, the other female. But she says the voices were not those of the vicar or anyone known to her." Whimsy stroked his chin thoughtfully. "An unknown visitor in the garden. Curious. And a female voice. This adds a new dimension to our case." "Could this be Miss Marsh visiting the vicar?" Bunter suggested. "Unlikely," Whimsy said sharply. "Her movements were accounted for. No, this stranger must be someone else entirely, another player in this shadowy drama." That night, as rain pattered softly against the window panes, Whimsy and Bunter laid out the accumulating pieces on a makeshift map. Each clue was a thread, and they were weaving them together into a tapestry that promised revelation, though the pattern remained tantalizingly incomplete. "There is one final aspect that troubles me," Whimsy murmured. "The vicar's study, soundproof to an extent unusual for a country parsonage. Why would a man of God require such precautions?" Bunter nodded. Perhaps he feared more than just the scandal. Perhaps he was aware of enemies near and far. Whimsy's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "Precisely, Bunter. And it is this fear that may hold the key to the killer's identity." As the clock chimed midnight, the mystery deepened, but Whimsy felt the surge of his usual confidence. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, very soon, the whispers at the Parsonage Gate would give way to a clear and inexorable truth. Whimsy awoke with the first grey light filtering through the curtains, a faint residue of dreams still clinging to his thoughts, a scattered fog of half-formed deductions and shadowed figures. He rose quietly, conscious not to disturb Bunter, who lay curled beneath a heavy blanket, the fire's dying embers casting soft warmth over the room. As he dressed, the details of the case circled back with a renewed clarity. The soundproof study, the furtive voices, the concealed will, each piece was now an integral thread in a tapestry of deception and desperation. Yet the central figure, the man who wielded this web of secrets, remained frustratingly elusive. Over a simple breakfast, Whimsy outlined a plan to Bunter. "We must recreate the scene at the Parsonage Gate, the moment of confrontation. Only then can we truly understand the choreography of this fatal encounter." Bunter nodded, already anticipating the subtlety of his master's reasoning. They left the vicarage under a sky the color of old pewter, the air damp and carrying a whisper of autumn's decline. The village was still waking, its narrow streets scattered with early risers and the occasional bleat of a distant sheep. At the gate, Whimsy methodically measured distances, noting the space between the gate and the nearby hedge, the incline of the path, and the position of the lantern which, according to witness statements, had been extinguished at the moment of the struggle. "Notice, Bunter," Whimsy said, "the gate's latch is high and stiff, requiring both hands to manipulate swiftly. A struggle here is not only noisy but physically constrained." He paced the ground, his footsteps deliberate. The assailant must have come from the south, concealed by the hedge, which would explain the scratch marks I noted. And yet, if the vicar had the gate closed behind him, how did the attacker gain access so quickly? There is a flaw here, an inconsistency. Whimsy knelt beside the soil and prodded at a barely visible depression. A second gate, perhaps, or a side entrance known only to a few? Bunter scratched his chin thoughtfully. "There is an old servant's path through the churchyard, overgrown but still passable. The locals call it the Shadow Walk, for its maze of hedges and low branches." "Exactly." Whimsy rose, a gleam in his eyes. "Our killer may have exploited this forgotten route to approach unnoticed, avoiding the watchful eyes of the village." They spent the afternoon walking the churchyard. There, boots disturbing dry leaves and moss. The Shadow Walk was indeed narrow, twisting between ancient gravestones and clumps of yew. Here one could hide easily, even in broad daylight, let alone under the cloak of night. Whimsy noted the placement of stones, the angle of moonlight as it might have fallen, and the echo or muffling of voices between walls and foliage. Returning to the parsonage, Whimsy summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Havisham, a small, tight-lipped woman with eyes sharp as needles. "Mrs. Havisham, might you recall any unusual visitors to the vicarage in recent days?" She pursed her lips, then admitted reluctantly, "There was a man, sir. Came calling late last week. He was dressed in dark clothes, spoke in low tones with Reverend Pritchard. Seemed agitated." "Did he linger long?" Whimsy asked. "No, just a few minutes. Left in a hurry. The vicar looked disturbed afterward." "And this was before the will was discovered?" "Just after, I believe." The revelation struck Whimsy like a cold gust. Someone had come to the vicarage aware of the will's contents, or at least its significance. This visitor's urgency might be the spark that ignited the deadly confrontation. Later, in the privacy of the study, Whimsy examined the will once more. The document was a precise, meticulous affair, stipulating that the vicar's property and certain funds were to be placed under trust, accessible only on conditions that protected the reputations of several persons, clearly the reason for secrecy. Whimsy's fingers traced the inked script, his mind reconstructing the chain of events that led to this quiet tragedy. He paused at a curious phrase, a codicil added in the margins, penned in a different hand, faint but unmistakably deliberate. This was no ordinary addition. It implied a last-minute change, an alteration that could have shifted the balance of power and incited someone to violence. How fortunate that the study's soundproofing might have shielded this secret. Whimsy mused aloud. Bunter, standing nearby with a ledger in hand, ventured, "Could the murderer be the author of the codicil?" Someone with both access and motive. Quite possibly. And yet, Wimsey said, the handwriting is deliberately disguised. We must have a suspect familiar with the vicar's script or capable of a practiced forgery. Their thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a telegram. Wimsey opened it carefully. The message was brief and terse, originating from London. A solicitor by the name of Mr. Hardwicke requested urgent consultation regarding the deceased vicar's affairs. "This may prove enlightening," Wimsey said, folding the paper neatly. "Let us meet this Mr. Hardwicke post-haste." The following day found Wimsey and Bunter on the slow train to London, the rhythmic clatter of wheels providing a steady backdrop for rumination. Wimsey reflected on the village's veneer of tranquility and how quickly it had cracked to reveal desperation and betrayal beneath. At Mr. Hardwicke's chambers, a tidy office lined with leather-bound volumes, the solicitor greeted them with a weary smile. He was a man whose profession had familiarized him with the darker side of human nature. "I am sorry to trouble you, Lord Peter, but the matter demands delicate handling," he began. "The will you examined is but a fragment of a more complex arrangement. There is, in fact, a second will, more recent, which significantly alters the distribution of assets and influence." Wimsey's interest piqued. A second will? That would explain the urgency and possible motive for murder. Indeed. The second will, however, was never registered, its whereabouts unknown since the vicar's sudden death. "I have reason to believe it is hidden within the parsonage, possibly in the study or its adjoining rooms." Wimsey exchanged a glance with Bunter. The stakes had risen. This concealed document might reveal the killer's identity, or at least the motive so cleverly concealed. Mr. Hardwicke continued, "Furthermore, there are discrepancies in the vicar's accounts, large sums withdrawn without clear explanation, suggesting financial manipulation." "A tangled web," Wimsey remarked dryly. "One where faith, trust, and greed entwine with deadly effect." Their conversation was interrupted by a faint knock on the door. A clerk entered with a bundle of papers, among them a report from the village constable, detailing recent interviews and noting a suspicious figure seen near the churchyard the night of the murder. Wimsey studied the description carefully. A tall man, dressed in a long coat and hat, pulled low, moving with purpose but avoiding notice. "Could this be the dark-clothed visitor Mrs. Havisham mentioned?" Bunter asked. "Very likely, and someone who knew the village well enough to exploit its hidden paths." That evening, back at the vicarage, Wimsey decided to test the theory of the second will's concealment. With the housekeeper's reluctant permission, he examined every inch of the study and adjoining rooms, searching behind panels, beneath floorboards, inside furniture joints. Hours passed with no success, until at last Bunter's keen eye caught a faint outline beneath the carpet near the bookcase, a slight bulge beneath the worn fabric. Lifting it carefully, they revealed a trap-door, its hinges rusted but functional. Wimsey's breath caught as he pried the trap-door open, revealing a narrow cavity filled with dust and the faint scent of old paper. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with a ribbon bearing the vicar's crest. With reverence, Wimsey extracted the papers. Unfolding the documents, he scanned the writing, the second will, unsigned but initialed in pencil, with amendments that dramatically shifted inheritances and conditions. The discovery was pivotal. The motive crystallized. Someone who stood to lose by the vicar's revisions would be desperate enough to silence him permanently. Yet the question remained: who had the knowledge, the access, and the motive to commit such a crime and to manipulate the timeline so cleverly? As midnight approached, Wimsey sat by the fire, the new will spread before him, pondering the human frailty that leads to such grim ends. The answer lay not in the documents alone, but in the shadows between them, in the whispered promises, jealousies, and betrayals that no legal paper could contain. Tomorrow he would confront those who stood most to gain or lose, with the silent certainty that the final act of this dark drama was yet to be played. The next morning dawned with a brittle chill in the air, as if the village itself were bracing for a storm. Wimsey rose early, the weight of the uncovered will heavy upon his mind. There was no room for hesitation now. The threads must be drawn tight and the knots undone. He summoned Bunter, and together they reviewed every detail, every subtle clue, weaving their understanding into a coherent whole. The question was no longer whether the murderer was among those who had something to gain from the second will. Of that Wimsey had little doubt. But how they had managed to orchestrate the deception so flawlessly, fooling the police and nearly every observer. They began by revisiting the key players. Reverend Pritchard's niece, Miss Eleanor Langley, the village solicitor, Mr. Hardwick, and the enigmatic housekeeper, Mrs. Havisham. Each had opportunity and motive, but it was their peculiar alibis and the subtle inconsistencies in their stories that held the greatest interest. Miss Langley, for instance, claimed to have been in London the night of the murder, attending a charity event with a circle of acquaintances who testified to her presence. Yet Wimsey had noted a curious detail. The clock in the vicarage study was set 15 minutes fast, which meant the timeline of the murder might be shifted accordingly. Could Eleanor's alibi survive that adjustment? She was quick-witted, and any discrepancy might be explained away. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Mr. Hardwick professed ignorance of the second will's whereabouts, emphasizing that his communications with the vicar had been purely professional and distant. Yet his sudden request to meet, the knowledge of the village's undercurrents, and the revelation of the vicar's financial irregularities suggested a more tangled involvement. And then there was Mrs. Havisham, whose silence was almost defiant. Her admission of the mysterious visitor was grudging, as though she bore a burden too heavy to share openly. Her knowledge of the household routines was intimate, and the possibility that she knew more about the hidden trap-door seemed plausible. Wimsey, as ever, paid particular attention to what was unsaid, to the glances exchanged, the fleeting hesitations, and the nuances of speech. The housekeeper's eyes, sharp as ever, betrayed a flicker of something. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the weight of long years spent watching secrets unfold behind closed doors? Turning to Bunter, Wimsey mused aloud. A murder committed with such careful orchestration requires not only motive and opportunity, but also a command of the setting. The parsonage itself is almost an accomplice. They resolved to stage a discreet gathering in the vicarage's drawing-room, inviting the three principal suspects under the guise of a discussion on the late vicar's affairs. Wimsey's plan was to observe their reactions, to prompt subtle revelations through casual conversation and pointed questions veiled in civility. As the guests arrived, each bore the veneer of composure, yet beneath it simmered tension palpable enough to be cut with a knife. Miss Langley was radiant but reserved, Mr. Hardwick appeared guarded, and Mrs. Havisham was composed, though her eyes darted occasionally toward the fireplace as if recalling a past flame. Wimsey opened the proceedings with an elegant comment on the weather and the beauty of the countryside, all the while watching carefully. "It is remarkable," he said, "how even the most tranquil of places can harbor the most complex human dramas. The parsonage, I find, has its own peculiarities." He allowed the statement to linger, then continued with his customary dry wit. "I am reminded of a Latin phrase which, regrettably, is often misquoted. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Let justice be done though the heavens fall. An apt sentiment, I think, for our present matter." Miss Langley inclined her head politely. "Indeed, Lord Peter, one wishes that justice might also bring peace." "Peace, yes," Wimsey murmured, "though it is peace that is sometimes the price of concealment." He then turned the conversation to the vicar's routines, asking about the timing of his correspondence and the unusual precautions he took regarding the will. The questions were framed as curiosity, but pierced the veneer of politeness like a surgeon's scalpel. Mr. Hardwick, to his credit, maintained a steady composure but betrayed a flicker of impatience when the topic turned to financial irregularities. Reverend Pritchard was a man of principle, he insisted. Any anomalies must have an innocent explanation. Mrs. Havisham's voice was measured but carried an undercurrent of resignation. The Reverend was very careful with his affairs, sir. But even the most careful cannot guard against human weakness. It was Eleanor Langley, however, who faltered slightly when questioned about the timing of her London visit. I assure you, Lord Peter, my presence at the charity event was unquestionable. Wimsey smiled thinly. Indeed, Miss Langley, yet it is the temporal details that often betray us. The precise moment a clock chimes or a door creaks. He produced the vicarage's clock key and deftly opened the back to reveal the mechanism within. A clock running 15 minutes fast is a subtle but significant detail. One wonders who might benefit from such a misdirection. The room grew noticeably colder despite the roaring fire, as though the ghosts of unspoken truths were gathering in the corners. Wimsey's gaze settled on Mrs. Havisham. You mentioned a visitor in dark clothes. Did the Reverend speak of this visitor afterward? Her hands trembled slightly as she replied, only that he seemed troubled and that the man was persistent. But I never saw the man again. Persistent, you say? Wimsey inquired. Would you say the visitor knew the parsonage well enough to find the shadow walk? She nodded reluctantly. I believe so. The dialogue continued with a delicate probing, weaving together testimonies and contradictions. Wimsey gently challenged the guests on small but telling points. The soundproofing of the study, the placement of the lantern, the concealed trapdoor. Each was met with a polite denial or evasive answer. Finally, Wimsey stood, raising a hand to command silence. Ladies and gentlemen, the threads of this mystery weave a complex pattern indeed. Yet every pattern has its center, a truth from which all else radiates. He paced slowly, letting his words sink in. The murder was no crime of passion, but a calculated act, born of fear and desperation. The second will, the hidden will, was the key. Whoever altered it sought to control the legacy and silence the Reverend before the truth emerged. Wimsey's eyes swept over the three faces. And I have come to a conclusion, not drawn from supposition, but from careful observation and the irrefutable logic of time and place. A tense silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the now open clock. In this room lies the architect of the crime, Wimsey declared. Someone who understood the vicarage's secrets, manipulated the timeline with the false clock, and exploited the shadow walk to approach unseen. Someone who had everything to gain and little to lose. The faces paled, but none yet confessed. Wimsey's voice took on a gentler tone. I shall give the guilty party a moment to consider the inevitability of truth. Minutes passed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Then, from the corner, a voice, low and trembling, spoke. It was me, Mrs. Havisham confessed, tears welling in her eyes. I did not mean for it to end this way, but I could not let the vicar destroy what little security I had left. Wimsey nodded slowly, the faintest shadow of compassion crossing his features. A tragic calculus, Mrs. Havisham. You chose control over conscience. She collapsed into a chair, the weight of her actions settling upon her like a shroud. Wimsey turned to the others. The law will take its course, but let us remember, in the end, it is the quiet desperation of the human heart that drives us all. As the police were summoned, Wimsey and Bunter retreated to the study. Lighting a cigar, Wimsey allowed himself a moment of reflection. Justice, dear Bunter, is a curious thing, not always swift nor always satisfying, but invariably necessary. Bunter smiled, lighting his own cigar. And we shall see it done, as always. Wimsey's eyes flickered with a wry amusement. Indeed. Now perhaps we may at last lay this whisper at the Parsonage Gate to rest. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the mullioned windows of the parsonage drawing-room as Lord Peter Wimsey settled into his accustomed armchair, cigar in hand, the faint curl of smoke drifting upward like a silent witness to the revelations soon to unfold. The assembled company, Miss Langley, Mr. Hardwicke, and the now hushed Mrs. Havisham, waited with varying degrees of apprehension and composure. The air was thick with expectation, as though the very walls had absorbed the tension and were eager to exhale the truth. Wimsey regarded them with his usual blend of arch amusement and studied gravity. "You will forgive me if I begin, not with accusation, but with a small matter of clockwork." He gestured toward the ornate clock that had so subtly altered the course of events. The Reverend's study clock, as you know, was 15 minutes fast, a detail so slight as to escape the notice of all but the most perspicacious observer. Yet it is precisely such trifles that unravel the grandest of deceptions. He turned to Mr. Hardwicke. "You, sir, were most insistent upon the Reverend's impeccable character and the innocence of his affairs, yet the records you provided showed transactions that, while minor, pointed to financial stress that would motivate secrecy, if not desperation." Hardwicke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "To Miss Langley," Wimsey continued, "your alibi, though supported by witnesses, rested on the exact timing of events, themselves referenced by the very clock in question. Adjust the clock's pace, and the certainty wavers like a candle in the wind." Miss Langley's eyes narrowed slightly, but her lips remained sealed. "And Mrs. Havisham," Wimsey said, fixing the housekeeper with a gaze at once sympathetic and unyielding, "your knowledge of the parsonage's secret passages and your admission of a mysterious visitor implicate you deeply. You knew the shadow walk. You concealed the will, and you manipulated the scene. Yet your motive was not avarice, but fear, a desire to protect what you believed the Reverend would destroy." A breath escaped her lips, a soft confession lingering in the room's charged atmosphere. Wimsey rose and began to pace slowly, his fingers steepled. The murder was committed not in a fit of passion, but as a cold act of preservation, preserving secrets, legacies, and a fragile social order. He paused before the window, gazing out at the fading light. Yet it was the timing, the false clock, the carefully staged alibis, the concealed trap-door, that formed the architect's true masterpiece, but even the most meticulous plans unravel when scrutinized by logic. Turning back, Wimsey's voice lowered to a tone of quiet finality. "Mrs. Havisham, your confession admits much, yet not all. The true fulcrum of this tragedy lies in the tangled relationships among us, the jealousies, the resentments, the silent bargains struck in shadow." He gestured to the others. "Each of you played your part, knowingly or unknowingly, in the tragedy that befell Reverend Pritchard, but only one wielded the final blow." A sharp intake of breath broke the silence. "Mr. Hardwicke," Wimsey said, his eyes now cold steel, "your attempts to misdirect with protests of innocence cannot withstand the scrutiny of time and motive. You feared exposure, feared loss, not merely financial but reputational. And so, you struck." The solicitor's face paled, the veneer cracking. "You have no proof." "Proof," Wimsey smiled thinly. "Proof lies not only in what is found, but in what cannot be explained away, the misaligned clocks, the silent corridors, the hidden correspondence. The moment you arrived at the parsonage, you set in motion a chain of deceit." Hardwicke's composure shattered, and he slumped into a chair, defeated. Wimsey resumed his seat, puffing thoughtfully. "Justice, in the end, is not a matter of spectacle, but of patient, unyielding reason. It is a lamp in the darkness, casting light where shadows sought to dwell." Miss Langley exhaled, a hint of relief softening her features. Mrs. Havisham's tears fell quietly. "It is a bitter truth, Lord Peter, but a necessary one. Whimsy inclined his head. Indeed, and as the bard reminds us, truth will come to light. Murder cannot be hid long. He paused, then with a faint twinkle in his eye added, though sometimes one must hold a very bright candle indeed. As the officers moved forward to take Mr. Hardwicke into custody, Whimsy stood and extended a hand to Bunter. Come, Bunter, the night grows old, and there are cigars to be enjoyed. Outside, the village resumed its quiet rhythm, unaware that beneath its serene surface, the tangled threads of human frailty and intellect had been expertly untied. The whisper at the Parsonage Gate had been silenced, not by superstition or fear, but by the unerring light of reason. And Lord Peter Wimsey, ever the enigmatic gentleman detective, vanished once more into the mist of England's countryside, leaving behind a tale of shadows illuminated and secrets revealed with just a hint of that dry, quintessentially British irony that was his trademark